Good morning, everybody. I'm so excited to be here because I get to talk about my favorite topic in the whole wide world, which is, how do we build a campus culture and, bake accessibility into your online programs. So before I get started, let's do another kind of gauge of the room. How many of you in here are faculty? Okay. Instructional designers? A lot of you. Directors, administrators over online learning programs? IT? Okay, only a couple. All right, anybody I didn't call out? Yes? Okay, so yeah, any other disability services providers in the room? Just you and me. All righty then. I can't say I'm surprised. I think one of the things that, as the more I talk about this stuff, the more I realized in 2005 when I joined Empire State College, which was kind of the online learning arm, if you will, of SUNY at that time, that I had jumped into a new pool and I didn't know how to swim. And like a lot of disability services providers, I kind of thought that as soon as you put things online that it was automatically accessible. There really wasn't much else to do, and quickly realized just how wrong I was. And so I'm not surprised that there aren't a lot of disability services folks here, because this is a topic, quite frankly, that scares the living daylights out of them. If you're not comfortable with technology, if you're not sure what to do with the technology, somebody asking you how a screen reader is going to work with your learning management system is enough to put the fear of God in you and make you run towards retirement a heck of a lot sooner. Especially for some of our folks who have, kind of come up through thinking about how do you do the layout of a room to make sure that the room is actually accessible and usable by, folks who have mobility concerns, dealing with Braille, versus digital access. It's a whole new world for a lot of us. So what I'm hoping that we can do today is this is going to be kind of a set the stage. Let's talk about exactly what this is. Let's, talk about how do we approach access for students with disabilities from an institution-wide perspective. So while it's helpful for me to know who's in the room, and it's probably helpful for all of you to know who your colleagues are here today, ultimately it really doesn't matter, and here's why. Accessibility is an institutional-wide responsibility. It is no more my responsibility at the University of Phoenix because it's in my title than it is our president's responsibility, than it is the vice president over curriculum and instructional design, than it is the provost, than it is our chief information officer. We all have a role to play at our various institutions in making sure that what we do is accessible to our students with disabilities. So how do we do it? So when I say bolting on, what am I talking about? I'm talking about accessibility as an afterthought. This is not part of the design. If you look at this, picture of a house, that has a really awkward-looking, ugly ramp on the front of this beautiful white colonial with black shutters, which is what I, grew up with in New York, my favorite type of house, and this ugly ramp that's just been kind of slapped on as an afterthought. It's not part of the design. It is not integrated into that environment. It may be functional. That is going to allow someone who uses a wheelchair or who uses crutches or has a motorized scooter to get into the house and to bypass the front steps. But it's not the best user experience, and certainly I would say that the folks who own that home are not thrilled about the way that ramp looks, even though they need it. Retrofitting is also way more expensive. So when we come to the conversation about costs, and this is one of the things that I constantly am harping on at every institution where I have worked. It is less expensive to build accessibility into your work than it is to go back and fix it later. One of the most frustrating questions that I have had in the almost 2 years that I've been at Phoenix, and luckily I don't hear it as much anymore, is, Kelly, why are we focusing all of this time, energy, and these resources on the needs of a few students at the expense of the many? And it makes my blood boil. I literally want to scream at them. But usually I compose myself and give a more blunt New York answer than a raging New York answer, which is, we're not. Accessibility that we build into our courses, that we build into our digital environments, benefits all students. And I think that that's going to be a theme that you're going to see us talk about throughout the day here today. These are good ideas that were designed for the needs of someone who has a disability, but benefit everyone who interacts with them. So when you look around this room, When you go down to the restroom and you see that there's a levered door handle as opposed to a knob, that's universal design. That is something that has been included into the design of the building, to make the environment more usable for students, for individuals with disabilities, but benefits all of us. So if you're approaching a door and you're carrying things and the door has a lever as opposed to a knob, you can hit that lever with your elbow and swing the door with your hip and you can walk through the door, right? If it's a knob, you can't do that. You've got to figure out how to balance that box while getting a hand free so that you can wrap your hand around the knob and then be able to turn the knob. And then you've got to be able to push it while still balancing this because you can't get the hip action going, right? Because you still have to have that hand on the knob to be able to open the door. That's something of universal design that then made that environment more usable. And there'll be other examples that we'll talk about. It also takes way more time to retrofit something than it is to build it in at the outset. The more that we talk about how do we build this into our design, whether it's the design of our curriculum, whether that curriculum's going online or going to be in a classroom, whether it's the design of a building, whether it's the design of a campus and looking at your campus footprint, the more time you invest at the outset in figuring out how to build this into your programs, it's going to pay dividends at the end because it's going to be already done, number one. Number two, it's going to be a more usable experience for everyone. So let's talk about baking it in. This is a picture from the Ed Roberts Center in Berkeley, in California. And what's really awesome is this red, that you see here, that instead of having stairs is one giant ramp that goes up to the second floor. And it's perfectly graded so that somebody who's using a wheelchair can just actually be able to roll on up to the second floor, as opposed to having, having stairs and then a separate elevator. I believe they do have an elevator in the building, but I love the design of this ramp. Look at this room. Has anyone noticed the ramp up here to the stage? It's built right into the design. It's right here. There's no ugly lift over here to get somebody up onto the stage. The ramp is right here. Somebody can roll right on up to the stage and be able to come up and participate at the same time. And you don't have to worry about a rental of a ramp or a lift or anything else and then have it destroy the aesthetic of the room. So this is an example of how you bake in and you build in access into your built environment. And if you include it at every stage of development, that is the key point here. Making sure that you're thinking about every stage of development and design. What do we need to build in for somebody who might have a disability? I think the obvious ones are students who are blind and students who are deaf. I mean, most of my instructional designers that I work with at the University of Phoenix know that if they have to have captions on a video. I don't have to remind them of that. But what we do have to sometimes talk about is what is going to be the experience for someone like Aaron, who very graciously allowed himself to be videotaped for this today, who is going to use multiple modalities of input and not be inputting with a traditional mouse. Students like Aaron sometimes also will be using mouth pointers and may also be using eye tracking instead of actually pointing and clicking. And what does that mean about the language we use? We've just had this conversation with my disability services staff this week where we were writing a little alert to students in our student portal, and she had it written to please click on the link below. I'm like, nope, we got to change that. It's please select the link, because there are a lot of students who don't click. And when we start talking about pointing and clicking, we are kind of prioritizing and emphasizing mouse use. And we know that students who have disabilities, or maybe I shouldn't assume this, but we should know the students who are blind or have other disabilities who aren't using the mice are not pointing and clicking on anything, because if you can't see, you don't know what you're pointing to or clicking on. So mice don't get used. So you're using keyboard commands and keyboard shortcuts, and so that's an important thing. And it becomes, it's a better user experience. I mean, look at how beautiful this is. This is a component of access that is actually built right into the aesthetic of the design, and it goes along with the rest of the building. And so it's an important, design component to say, we're not going to stick those individuals with disabilities in a separate but equal, environment. I mean, what do we know about separate but equal? It doesn't work. And every experience doesn't have to be about equality, it has to be about equity. And so you want them to have a really good experience and to remember that equity is our goal here. We want our students to have the best experience possible based on the unique abilities and skill sets that they bring to the interaction. And this is also way more efficient and cost effective. So that's kind of setting the stage for what we're going to be thinking about. So what does it mean for digital environments? We need to approach the design of digital environments like we do with the design of a building. And I think this is one of the areas where I really appreciate the architectural principles of universal design and what those mean for the digital environment. And there's lots of different ways, and Sean's going to talk about a universal design right before lunch, so I'm not going to steal his thunder, but there are lots of different ways that we can think about how we approach designing an environment so that it is usable by all individuals who encounter it. And so that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about access and accessibility. So when you think about your learning management system, I want you to think about those courses and your learning management system, and when it's built accessibly, that it's like your ramps and elevators. It gets the student to the classroom. And so a lot of times I think folks don't understand kind of how the content and the container go hand in hand, and how each one needs a different level of consideration. So we need to be considering when we're purchasing a new learning management system how accessible that environment is, because if we don't have access in the building, the structure, then it doesn't matter what we do with the content inside of it, because they're not going to be able to access it. Because if they are working with a system that doesn't have that accessibility built in, it's going to be really difficult for them to be able to navigate to the content. What I'm going to be talking about mostly this morning is our proactive approach. And this is what I call the one size fits most. So you guys remember going, probably back when I was, younger, and a lot of you in the room too, there used to be this thing called one size fits all, and then it morphed into one size fits most because, there was a recognition that you couldn't build something that would fit everybody, but it might fit, the majority of the population. I would posit that most of the time they were not considering that most of the population was more size like me than, necessarily some of our more petite friends in the room, but whatever. I'm not bitter, but when you think about the fact that this is what happens when you're a 6-foot-tall redhead. Number one, you don't blend into the crowd, and number two, you get really annoyed that it's really hard to buy off the rack. But I digress. What you want to think about that one size fits most approach is that is what you're going to do regardless of who's going to be using the particular item that you're designing. So when a clothing manufacturer is thinking about one size fits most, they're not thinking about what I look like compared to what Harriet looks like, okay? They're not thinking about how wide my shoulders are compared to how wide her shoulders are. They're just thinking, okay, what if we take all of the sizes that are manufactured in the United States and what gets purchased, what's the average size, and we're going to make it a little bit bigger than that so that we can say this is where we're going to fit most of the people. And that's kind of the approach that you need to take when you're thinking about accessibility and baking this into your systems. You want to, there are certain givens. If you're posting video in your courses, they should be captioned. Well, why? Because you have a lot of students who are not going to have perfect acuity of their hearing anymore. That's one of the things that happens as we get older, as our colleague so rightly pointed out. Disability is the only protected class that we all could join at one time or another, and likely will. We likely will join that protected class at some point in our life. We may lose, the ability to hear. We may have to get bifocals, so, then can't see without them, even though they're making you sweaty right now. But you have to, your vision will change. All of those things are going to happen. So we know videos should have captions on them, regardless of who's going to come into the course. And the reason that you do that ahead of time, than waiting for the videos to be captioned until a student asks for them, is because it takes a really long time. If it's not your video, you've got to get the copyright permission. You've got to, find out who the owner is. You got to then send it out and get it captioned. Then it's got to be synced up. It's a considerably faster process than it has been before, but it still takes time. We have 5-week-long courses at the University of Phoenix. If a student doesn't let me know that they're in that course until 3 days into the first week, and it takes me 2 weeks to get that video turned around and captioned, guess what? They're now in week 4 before they have the material for week 1. What have I just done to that student's experience and their chances for success? So that's why you do that sort of thing ahead of time. This is what made me so angry about Berkeley's response to the DOJ action about their MOOCs. I agree they shouldn't have taken everything down, and I agree that it's it costs a heck of a lot of money to get all of those video captions, and I get why they made that decision from a cost-benefit perspective when they considered their population of students, especially because those complaints came from two individuals who were affiliated with Gallaudet and not with Berkeley. But the problem with that is that if they had thought about making those videos accessible before they ever put them online, everyone would have been able to access them, and it would have been a lot less expensive and easier for them to do that ahead of time. I'm on my soapbox a little bit, but I've got the mic, so I can do that. Versus what it is that we do in our disability services office, which is the reactive approach. That's the individual tailoring. So if I'm going to go and I'm going to buy a shirt that says one size fits most, the chances are I can likely squeeze myself into it and it'll be okay. I might have to let it out, in a couple places. But if, Harriet, I'm going to pick on you just because we met right during the break here. Harriet is considerably smaller than I am. So if she puts on a garment that's one size fits most, it's going to have to be tailored for her. The shoulders are going to be drooping down. She's going to have way too much here in the middle of it, and it's going to have to be taken in places. And so that's what we do in a disability services office is we look at, how do we design accommodations that are going to meet those students' individual needs? And that's the two parts of my world. We just had a conversation this last week. We're doing a pilot with some technology-enhanced courses in a different way at Phoenix. And we have students who are going into them, and they changed one of the participation requirements, and we had previously advised faculty and students that participation was not covered by an extended time accommodation. Well, with the way they changed participation for this particular course, it actually should have been covered, and we didn't find it out until a student questioned us. And so have a conversation with the folks in instructional design and say, you guys got to let me know that this stuff is going on. And they're like, oh, wait, you have to approve it? I'm like, no. We're not talking accessibility here where I get to have a go or no-go decision. This is more, here's some information for you, Kelly, because you have to decide what's a reasonable accommodation and what isn't for an individual student. And so that's where those two pieces work together. There are certain things, as I said, proactive approach, we know captions are always reasonable. If anyone at your institution tries to say that captions are not reasonable because they cost too much money, tell them to go look at the regs for the ADA, and it is specifically mentioned in the regs for the ADA and in the statute itself because of the telecommunications, section of it, that communication must be accessible. Captions are always going to be a reasonable accommodation. A lot of the other stuff can be kind of, iffy depending on, how it's implemented, but that's one, that we want to make sure that, we get done ahead of time. So, talking about the law, and I promise not to spend too much time on the law because, the law really is our floor here, it's not a ceiling. And so if you think about the way that all of these various laws work together and the different guidelines work together, it is to set the minimum standard. The minimum that you should be doing is providing access to your programs, services, activities, and courses. That's what 504 and the ADA say. You are not going to find regulations written for 504 or for the ADA that tell you what you need to do from a web accessibility perspective. It doesn't exist. We've been waiting since 2010 when DOJ first told us that they were working on rules for Title II and Title III. It's not going to happen. The Trump administration took it off the docket, so we're not going to get rules for the ADA or 504 anytime soon. But what we do have is a lot of really good guidance. And the guidance comes in the form of those of us who have had the pleasure of working with investigators from the Office for Civil Rights and who have signed resolution agreements. There are a lot of us. Anyone else in the room who has had an active resolution agreement, either with OCR, a lawsuit, or NFB action? I know you guys have. Anyone else? Oh, we're the lucky ones. The rest of you guys are all smart because you're doing this before OCR shows up. That's the smart way to do this, or before NFB, because really if the NFB gets involved, you just kick it up a whole nother notch. But it's all good advocacy work, and what it has done really has emphasized and strengthened the fact that there are certain guidelines you should be following to ensure that your websites and your digital environments are accessible. And that's where 508, not so much 508. By the way, if anyone tries to tell you that 508 applies to institutions of higher education, they're lying. Or they're misinformed. And I say that because 508 only applies to the procurement activities of the federal government. Federal agencies have to follow 508 standards. as written. If you are in a state that has adopted 508 guidelines as state law, yes, you have to follow it, and that may be the case. But I have read, I'm working on my doctorate, and I've read a lot of articles in the last couple months where, the researchers are saying that 508 applied to institutions who accept federal funds, and that's just incorrect. That it doesn't. What 508 does is it does give us a standard to follow, but it's not enforceable by OCR or the Department of Justice for an institution of higher education. The WCAG standards, and you'll hear us talk about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as WCAG or WCAG or WCAG, and however else we talk about it. Those are international standards that have really become the gold standard to follow. They just recently released in June WCAG 2.1, which adds some guidelines to the AA standard as well to kind of address some of the needs that we had around mobile accessibility and cognitive disabilities. And so it is really helpful to look at those and to see what those new standards are. You're still going to see a lot of reference, though, to WCAG 2.0 AA. And that is, if you have not adopted a benchmark standard, I advise that you adopt those. That's what DOJ and the Office for Civil Rights have set forth as the standard to be following. So if you want to protect your institution, that's the way to go. But they're not enforceable by law unless you're Wichita State or myself with active resolution agreements. Lucky us. No, it's actually good. It's actually good. All right, getting started. What do you need to do? First, you need to understand the current culture and climate of your institution. And this is what Devin was talking about, that we were going to talk about institutional culture. Part of my responsibilities, and one of the things that I talk about frequently at the University of Phoenix, is that we are building an inclusive culture of accessibility. And it's not just about compliance. It's not just about making sure that we meet the provisions of our resolution agreement. It's making sure that our students have access to the courses, the programs, the activities, the services that we provide. It is a campus-wide approach. I cannot do this by myself. Phoenix is a huge organization. Most of you are coming from varying sizes of institutions, but you still have partners on campus that you need to be able to make sure that accessibility is a priority. You can't do it by yourself. My disability services colleague will be able to tell you, we only get so far. Whether we're talking to a faculty member about a student's accommodations, whether we're talking about access, there's only so far we can take that without having our partners jump in and say, no, this is really important too. And you have to find those new champions. I kind of talk about it, filling up your dance card and having conversations and meetings with folks across campus about accessibility and learning what each, department or unit does so that you can have, a better sense of where do you build this in? Where do you bake this into your process? And understanding what it is that your colleagues do is so critically important. I think we have kind of taken that for granted in disability services from my perspective, is that, we just assume everyone knows what it is that we do and that, we know what everyone else does. Well, no, actually, we kind of don't. Higher ed has changed a lot, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. And so we can't take for granted that we know. We need to have those conversations. The what's in it for me? I love it when this happens. None of you faculty in the room ever talk about that, right? Of course not. You guys are all here. But, there are a lot of folks on campus who are like, all right, Kelly, but what's in it for me? Well, number one, you're not going to have the redhead breathing down your neck anymore. And if you don't have a redhead on your campus, I'm sorry. You can rent me out, maybe. But the idea of it is that it's not so much about what's in it for you, but what's in it for all your students. Why is it important that we build captioning into our videos? Yes, it's for the students who can't hear. But let me talk to you about an adult student. Let me talk to you about the adult student who is working in a cubicle and takes a lunch hour and forgot to bring headphones with him to do watch his video for class on his lunch hour. If there are captions on that video, they can now watch that video at their lunch hour without the sound and still be able to do what they needed to do without their headphones and not disturb the other people who are in their cubicles as well. And so that's why we do these things, because if you ever listen to Jay Leno, he used to talk about, frequently about the studies of who uses captions most often. And I'll tell you, it wasn't the deaf. It was, individuals in a relationship where one partner wanted to go to bed and the other partner didn't, and wanted to watch TV, and the other one was like, no, I can't watch TV and fall asleep. This happens in my house every night. And, it'd be like, can you turn that down? And well, then I can't hear it. We'll turn on the captions. That's who's using captions. It's been keeping, marital health, for many, many years. And we'll talk a little bit more on other slides about what's in it for me as well. Your policies and procedures. Do you actually have an accessibility policy? That's something to consider. Have you written standard operating procedures? We live and die by standard operating procedures at the University of Phoenix. We have too big of an organization not to. And so everyone knows what the SOP says, and that's what we look to. But you have to know your culture. Do policy and procedures get looked at, or is it more that informal networking that's really important? Because if you start walking around saying, well, Kelly said we should have standard operating procedures, but your campus doesn't do that, you're not going to get anywhere. And you're going to go, man, why did they bring in that redhead? She's an idiot. But really, you have to understand what your campus climate is and what they can handle. You also have to understand the technology. And I'm not saying you have to be, Cindy. I'm not Cindy. Cindy knows the technology way better than I do. I know just enough to be dangerous. I can tell you what a screen reader does versus what a magnifier does. I know a little bit about how trackballs work, and I can explain that to somebody who knows less than I do. And that's the kind of information that I need to know. But I don't have to be the one who knows how to program something with HTML code. I've got people on my staff who do that. And God help me if he ever leaves, because it will be bad. But, we all have our different skill sets. But I need to know at least a little bit about what some of those pieces mean so that I can be able to advocate for the policy and the procedures and with the administration in the way that I need to. So you need to know a little bit, but you don't have to be expert in it. And then also what the professional development opportunities are. Cindy's going to talk more about this, so I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but except to say, where are the places that your faculty and your staff go to learn more about what they need to do? If you're not already connected with them, you have to be. And access has to be part of that conversation. So let's talk about developing a policy. Who needs to be at the table? Is this something that you should be doing as a siloed activity with just you and your staff? Audience participation here, yes or no? No. Well, all right, we cheated. I put the slide up. So if you didn't say no, you didn't read the slide. No, you can't. Because again, what did I say when I got started? This is an institution-wide responsibility. I can't sit down and write a policy and assign tasks to the Center for Learning and Teaching and Learning at my institution because I don't have oversight of that. I'm not in charge of what it is that they do. I know enough, but I don't know enough to write procedures for them. I need to sit down and have a conversation with leadership there and say, this is what I'd like us to do. This is what I think we need to do for access. How is this going to work in your world? And they've got to be at the table. Academics have to be at the table. We have an accessibility policy committee at Phoenix, and I have program deans on that committee. Part of it is because we consider exceptions to our, when we have tools that we need to use or content that we need to use that doesn't match the WCAG standards, we review that and we come up with alternative access plans. So I need to have the academics in the room to talk about, and so that I can teach them and help them help me go through that analysis that we talked about earlier of looking at what's reasonable. How do we do that? They have to be in the room. IT has to be in the room because there's a lot that gets purchased out of IT, your infrastructure, your hardware, your software. I'm just guessing that most of your institutions are going to have kind of a similar approach to IT as what we do. They have to be in the room because they're going to make decisions that have a domino effect across your campus. And if they're not thinking about access, you're going to have a mighty big problem. So that vendor that I talked about earlier, they decided to go with that vendor before I was hired almost 2 years ago. And again, we made the decision. We can't then say that our decision to go with a particular vendor over another vendor is now an undue burden because we put ourselves there. And so we got to figure out how are we going to make it accessible? How are we going to work with that vendor to get that product accessible? And then also, I already talked about, course design and tools, in terms of our educational technology team, but procurement. One of our breakout sessions is going to be about procurement because procurement is such an important part of your accessibility policy. There are so many things that get purchased or used at your institution, whether it has any money attached to it or not. And so procurement has to be part of this. Student services, your disability services office, financial aid. I think one of the things that I took away from the panel this morning, and was so glad that it came out, was that we have to make sure that we have accessibility in all aspects of the student experience. That is so important, is making sure that the students, no matter who they interact with on your campus, that they have an accessible experience. And so that's why marketing needs to be there, because in many places, marketing is controlling your publicly facing website. Enrollment and admissions, legal and ethics and compliance, huge at the University of Phoenix. Because we are a large organization, and there's some complications that come with our tax status that mean that we have a lot more consultations with attorneys than I thought I was going to at Phoenix. But it's great because they're in the room, we can talk about the issues, and we can make sure that we're making a decision together. Veterans. And this is one thing that I think is really important. Whoever your services are for veterans on your campus, it is not that all veterans have a disability. However, when you look at the incidence of disability in that population of students as compared to your traditional population of students, there is a higher incidence of disability among those students. They are also the least likely to come forward and request assistance and request accommodations. So accessibility becomes really important for that population of students. How do you build in accessibility to your environment so that they don't have to ask for accommodations, that they can actually be able to do what they need to do without having to step forward and say, hey, guess what, I actually have a disability and I want accommodations. And then any of your students. What I love about the fact that we had the video that Tori put together with Aaron is that we really got the student voice. I can stand here and I can talk about this all day long, but I'll tell you something, if I had a student who was here talking about this with me, you guys would be listening in a very different way. And the message would be received in a very different way. Students are the most important stakeholder that I have. And so we need to make sure that we are bringing that student voice, especially in an environment like Phoenix where my students aren't in Phoenix with me. How do I get that voice into the process so that we can be able to make sure that their voices are heard? So what do you include in your policy? As I said earlier, you have to adopt a standard. Everyone needs to know what it means when I say at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, we're accessible. What does that mean? It might mean WCAG 2.0 AA. It might mean 508. 508 and WCAG 2.0 AA should match right now because the effort that the Access Board went through and implemented in January. But what is that standard? What are you going to follow? And make sure that everyone knows what it is and knows how to meet it. What are the stakeholder roles within the process? As Devin had asked us earlier on the panel, and the cost question that came up, what does that look like on your campus? That's going to vary campus to campus. I can't tell you what to do on your campus unless I come in and learn more about the campus. But I know that at Phoenix, the role of the Center for Teaching and Learning is design of courses. And so I know that that's their responsibility. What role do I play in that? I play more of a consultative role, as opposed to students who need accommodations. That's in my shop. I get to decide how that rolls out, and then other people consult with us on that. And so you need to know who owns what. How does the campus spend its money? How are you going to work with external partners? This is a huge part of what I do at Phoenix, is meeting with external partners. We buy a lot of technology. We buy a lot of content that we put into our courses. And it's not enough for us just to get a VPAT, a voluntary product accessibility template, for those of you who don't know what a VPAT is. That, again, the key word to keep in mind with that is voluntary. That sometimes means they are not worth the paper they're written on. But it's a good starting place for us with external partners to say, what are you doing for accessibility? And if a vendor tells you that they are ADA compliant, push back and say there's no such thing. Because, again, remember what I said earlier, there are no regulations for them to follow. What you want to hear is what they're doing to test for accessibility. Are they following the WCAG standards? That's what I want to hear. Are they following 508 standards? I think the most important thing to keep in mind about the 508 refresh that went into effect in January of this year is that it made some consistency between WCAG 2.0 AA and 508, which made it easier for our partners. Because now they're not trying to figure out which standard do they need to follow. There's one standard, and that makes it a lot easier for them. You also have to have a plan for curriculum design and evaluation. So how are you going to look at what your courses look like, and are they actually meeting your standard? What about the library? The library is huge. There's so much that's done online right now with the library that you have to have a plan in place for how you're going to deal with inaccessible content. Because I got to tell you, JSTOR has articles from 1932. Those are the kinds of PDFs that Aaron was talking about, and probably worse, because the paper's not real good when they did the scan. It's not going to be have gone through the OCR process, which is optical character recognition, for those of you who don't know, which is a process by which you extract the text out of the image. And likely it was written in serif font. I always confuse the two. Serif has the little wingy-dingy things on the D's and the B's, right? Okay, thank you for nodding. That makes it really difficult to do character recognition, because your D may actually look like an L, and they may think that that was a C before the L, and then your word is going to be misspelled, and you've got to go through and edit that and figure out what that is. That's why PDFs are a nightmare. Also, academic support and tutoring. Again, remember, whatever we make available to students, regardless of disability, we have to make available to students with disabilities. And so when you're looking at things like Smart Thinking or Tutor.com or any of those vendors and partners, or how you're delivering tutoring to your students, that also has to be accessible. And it's every web presence. It's your student portal. It's how students register for classes. It's how they pay their bills. A lot of times people will say to me, "Oh, Kelly, you don't have to worry about that. That's just how we collect money from students." Duh. Every single student has to do that. Guess what? So do the 4,900 students that I accommodate. And they're like, "Oh, we didn't think about that." Well, yeah, students with disabilities have to pay too, guys. We don't give them a free pass, as much as they would like us to. So I think we've covered a lot of this. I think the most important thing about setting a standard is that it is very proactive and it raises awareness on your campus. And when you start talking about this is the university's adopted standard, folks start to pay attention a little bit more, because it has a little bit more oomph to it than just saying we need to make things accessible. Give folks a roadmap. Give folks a path forward of how to make it accessible. Talk about, and I have a slide here in a second that talks about the principles of WCAG, and I promise we're not going to go into it very much because I'm running out of time, which means that I'm from New York. I'm going to start talking faster. But it allows everyone to be consistent and to know what we're talking about. So here are the 4 principles of accessibility under the WCAG standards, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Has to be perceivable, which is the ability to see, hear, or experience information. It has to be operable. This is when we start talking about using multiple modes of input. So it could be a keyboard, it could be a mouse, it could be head pointers, it could be eye tracking. There was an article on LinkedIn not too long ago where someone with ALS was using eye tracking for typing. New technology, fantastic, and is allowing him to be independent in a way that he wasn't able to before. So cool. There's so many cool things that we can do with that. Understandable, creating clarity or understanding, such as labels, information, and relationships. One of the things that we find a lot when we evaluate a website is that the form has no labels. So you could be clicking through and tabbing into a form to fill out, and all you do is you get these fields where you're supposed to input information, but there's no label to tell you what you're supposed to put there. There may be, when you look at the visual interface, that it says next to it first name, but there's nothing on the field itself where you have to input that. Well, if you are using a screen reader, the screen reader isn't reading the heading that's next to the field, it's reading what's on the field. And so understanding that basic level of how that screen reader works is going to help you design more effectively. And then it has to be robust. And this is probably the hardest, principle and guidelines, to understand. But to the broadest extent possible, learning outcomes are based on learning the topic and are tool agnostic. So users may change a tool to interact with content. So this is when we start talking about, and there are specific guidelines, but to kind of put it into a course context, when I talk with folks about wanting to use QuickBooks in an accounting course, well, guess what? QuickBooks is not accessible. Really kind of sad, but it's not. And so there are other ways that we've been able to do accounting and to teach accounting before QuickBooks was around. So let's go back to the basics. How can they do some of the same things with an Excel document to be able to, which would be accessible and not have to use the tool. So thinking about your learning objectives as not being tool specific. So what do we review? We review everything. We look at how the learning management system works. We talk about, the third-party content, and I've talked about that a little bit already. Again, going back to, like Pearson and the My Insert Your Subject Here labs, we were teaching math long before Pearson had that. So go back to the basics. How do you do that? And how do you look at the content and make sure what it can do? Documents are huge. The PDF issue is huge because a lot of people don't understand that a PDF is inaccessible in its native form, especially if it's a scan. Video and audio content. My business folks love Tableau. They really want to do a lot of that, visual data analytics and be able to, present information in that way, and that's all great, but Tableau's inaccessible. SAS, visual analytics, is accessible, so we use that as an alternative. They still want Tableau, though, because that's what the field uses. And so always keep in mind that if you're getting pushback from your academic colleagues, they're thinking, too, their students' future employability. So how can we work with this? How can we make sure that students are exposed to Tableau, but yet not require them to use that to submit their assignments? There's lots of things there. So when we do an accessibility evaluation, we review the VPAT, as I said before, and any other documents that we can get from the vendor. How does it interact with a screen reader? We need to know what that experience is going to be by the student. Can it handle multiple inputs? What happens when the student tries to use the keyboard? A lot of times the tab order is what gets screwed up here because folks don't understand that if you're not visually looking at something and pointing and clicking to it, if you're using a keyboard, you have to go through so many clicks. I talk to it about it as how many clicks does it take to get to the center of the Tootsie Pop, right? And often it's more than 3 because you can't just crunch the Tootsie Pop when you're using a tab to keyboard in. Do we have time to navigate to all elements before inactivity will trigger an action? And are there alternatives, for non-text content? So when you have an image, Devin, used a great image earlier today. If we had somebody who was blind in the room, they would have no idea what that image was because we didn't describe it. Sorry, Devin, I'm gonna pick on you for a second. But that's something that we need to think about. I'm sure when you look at the PowerPoint slide, there was likely an alternative text on that image, and that's how we make that accessible. And what does the color contrast and display look like? Okay, things you need to think about and be asking your partners. Oh my gosh, I planned way too many slides. Sorry, guys. What is this tool, product, or website going to be used for? We need to know what the purpose is. Are there alternative means to teach this content? We've already talked about that. And who are the students? This is one that's really important for me at the University of Phoenix and an issue that I brought up earlier. Our students are older. Our students are more removed from their last formal schooling and likely have not had that support to transition into the college environment the way that our students who are 18 to 22 have. And so that does present a new wrinkle for us in terms of looking at accessibility and disability services. When you're talking with your vendors, what accessibility standards are they using? If they tell you ADA, they're lying, or they don't know. How do you evaluate your product for accessibility? I want to hear that they're looking to the WCAG standards. I want to hear that they have some JAWS users and that they're looking at screen reader testing. Do they do user testing with screen readers? And not just folks who are sighted and use screen readers, but actual folks who are screen reader users because they have to be. There's a difference. Does the company have an accessibility roadmap? And what feedback mechanism do they have in place for us to share our accessibility concerns? That's a huge one. The work that my accessibility team does with vendors is huge in terms of sharing with them things that they need to address and the issues that we came up with that they wouldn't have found on their own. That's a big one. So what happens when something's not accessible? Is it a fundamental alteration to remove the content or the tool? We go through a whole analysis of that. We talked about that earlier, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time. And then what alternatives exist? Do they allow the student to access the content independently? This is an important piece of it. We can't just hire a reader and say we're done. We can't tell the student they have to hire someone in their life to come and read to them because that doesn't allow them to be independent because then they're beholden on somebody else's time and schedule. And that's not going to pass muster with the way that OCR and DOJ have been looking at these. And develop that plan, that alternative access plan before the student enters the course. And one of our breakouts will be about course design and evaluation, and we can talk more about it there. So looking ahead to the breakouts, as I'm right at 10:15. Procurement. There are questions that your facilitators are going to have, but this is one of the breakout sessions that I think is really important in terms of saying that this is a standard policy component that OCR has recommended in our resolution agreements. And this is intended to be a fail-safe mechanism. And so you want to look at statement of standards. What is the evaluation process? What is the required information from the vendor? And contract language. And so I'm looking forward to that conversation in that breakout room. Course review and revision. How are your courses designed? Do you do a master course model, or do faculty have the ability to throw up a course into a course shell at any point in time? And when does it make sense for you or whoever is responsible for accessibility to review it to see what is accessible and what's not? What resources do you have to conduct an accessibility evaluation? I'm sure many of you are going, oh my God, that redhead is crazy if she thinks I can do an accessibility evaluation. I don't know enough, nor do I have the resources to do that. And so I think that that's going to be a really important conversation in the breakouts. How do you build those resources? How do you get that expertise if you don't already have it? And then, how the WCAG principles fit in. And then the campus culture and accessibility, which is also known as what will fly on your campus and what is a hard no, regardless of how it's pitched. You need to know that. You need to know what is going to work on your campus and what isn't. And it's important to understand those unwritten rules of how things get done. Who are your power brokers, and how can you get one of them to be your champion? How does the campus react to external demands and regulations? What population has the most influence? What's your governance structure? It's such a breath of fresh air for me right now at Phoenix that we do not have full-time tenured faculty, because I don't have to deal with the faculty senate. I loved dealing with the faculty senate at my last institution. We could get a lot done. However, when things are spiraling out of control in other parts of the academy, guess what starts coming up? This is impinging upon my academic freedom. And that's a difficult conversation to navigate, so I'm hoping that comes up in the breakout. And then I just said that one. So that's what we're going to do from here. I think we've got 15 minutes, or 10:30 we've got to be in the breakout room, so I'm going to stop talking and let Devin tell you about that.